On the 5th of May 1960, the United States told the world a small story about a small aeroplane. A weather research flight operated for NASA had gone missing somewhere over Turkey. The pilot had reported trouble with his oxygen. It was regrettable, and it was routine, and it was entirely false. There was no weather flight. The aircraft had not been over Turkey. It had been more than 1,000 miles inside the Soviet Union, photographing missile sites, and it had been shot out of the sky 4 days earlier. What the men who wrote that statement did not know was that the Soviet Union already had the wreckage and the pilot alive. Nikita Khrushchev had deliberately said nothing about either. He had left a hole in the story, and he was waiting to see what the Americans would put in it. They filled it with a lie in public under their own president's name. This is how a single aircraft, flying higher than anything had flown before, brought down a summit, ended a thaw, and taught two superpowers exactly how far the other would go. To understand the crisis, you have to understand the machine. In the early 1950s, the United States had a problem it could not solve. It did not know what was inside the Soviet Union. It did not know how many bombers Moscow had built, or where the missiles were, or whether the terrifying numbers in the newspapers were real. And it had no way to look, so it built something to look with. At a secret Lockheed workshop that its own engineers nicknamed the Skunk Works, a designer called Kelly Johnson drew an aircraft that was really a glider with a jet engine bolted into it, enormous thin wings, a fuselage stripped of everything that was not essential, an airframe so light it could barely survive its own landing. They called it the U-2. It flew at 70,000 feet, 13 miles up at the edge of the atmosphere, where the sky above turns black at noon, and it carried a camera of extraordinary precision, capable of resolving objects on the ground from the top of the sky. It could photograph a Soviet airfield from an altitude where, the Americans believed, absolutely nothing could reach it. That belief was the whole basis of the program, and it was the part that mattered, because every one of these flights was, in the plainest legal terms, an act of war. A foreign military aircraft, deliberately crossing a sovereign border, photographing defense installations. There is no reading of international law that makes that acceptable. President Eisenhower knew it, and he authorized the flights anyway, reluctantly, one at a time, because the alternative was strategic blindness. And for 4 years, it worked. The U-2s crossed the Soviet Union and came home with photographs that quietly dismantled the great fear of the era. The images showed that the so-called missile gap, the idea that Moscow was racing ahead, was largely a phantom. But the Soviets could see them. That is the detail people miss. Soviet radar tracked the intruders almost from the beginning. They simply could not climb high enough to do anything about it. For 4 years, Moscow watched American aircraft cross its territory at will and could only protest through diplomatic channels, which meant admitting it was helpless. That humiliation was building year after year into a determination to bring one down. On the 1st of May 1960, a pilot named Francis Gary Powers took off from Peshawar in Pakistan. The mission was designated Grand Slam, and it was the most ambitious yet attempted. A complete crossing of the Soviet Union, entering from the south and landing in Norway, photographing missile and nuclear sites along the way. It was also May Day, the Soviet holiday. Civil air traffic was quiet, which made the single, high-altitude intruder impossible to miss on the radar screens. The order went out to bring it down at any cost. Near the city of Sverdlovsk, deep in the Urals, a battery fired a salvo of surface-to-air missiles. One detonated close behind the U-2. It did not destroy the aircraft outright. It did not need to. The shockwave tore away the fragile tail of a machine built with no margin at all, and the aeroplane began to come apart around its pilot at 13 miles up. In the confusion of that same engagement, the Soviets also shot down one of their own fighters, and its pilot was killed. Powers was pinned by the forces of the spin, unable to reach the ejection handle. He later said he did not trust it in any case. There were persistent rumors among the pilots that the seat was rigged to destroy the evidence and the man in it. So he opened the canopy and climbed out of a disintegrating aircraft by hand, and his parachute opened automatically. He was carrying something else. U-2 pilots were issued a silver dollar, hollowed out, with a fine needle inside coated in shellfish toxin, a poison that kills in seconds. It was never framed as an order. It was described as an option, for a man who decided that whatever waited below was worse. Powers did not use it. He came down in a Soviet field and was taken by farmers, and the Soviet Union now held something no cover story could survive: a living American pilot, his flight equipment, his cameras, and the identifiable wreckage of a machine that was not by any stretch a weather plane. Here, Khrushchev did something genuinely clever. He announced that an American aircraft had been shot down, and stopped there. He said nothing about a pilot, nothing about wreckage. He let Washington assume what Washington had always been told to assume, that at that altitude, a shoot-down meant a dead pilot and a destroyed aircraft, and that the truth had burned up on the way down. So the United States told its story. NASA produced a statement about a weather research flight. An aircraft was actually repainted in NASA markings and shown to reporters. The lie was specific, it was documented, and it was issued in the name of the government of the United States. And then Khrushchev sprang it. He revealed that the pilot was alive in Moscow and talking, and that the Soviet Union had the cameras and the film. In a single stroke, the American president was caught, in public, in a demonstrable lie. Eisenhower then did something no leader in his position had done. Rather than let his own government take the fall, he acknowledged that he had authorized the flights himself, honest and catastrophic. 2 weeks later, the leaders of the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France gathered in Paris for a summit that was supposed to be the beginning of the end of the Cold War. There had been movement, talk of arms control, of a test ban, of a visit by Eisenhower to Moscow. For the first time since 1945, the temperature was falling. Khrushchev arrived and demanded an apology and a promise that the overflights would end, and punishment for those responsible. Eisenhower would state that the flights had been suspended. He would not apologize for them. The summit collapsed inside a day. Khrushchev walked out, the Moscow visit was cancelled, and the thaw that had taken years to build was simply gone. What replaced it was the hardest stretch of the entire Cold War. Within 15 months, the Berlin Wall went up, and within 30, Soviet missiles were in Cuba. One aeroplane, one lie, one refusal to apologize, and the door that had briefly opened closed for a decade. In August, the Soviet Union put Gary Powers on trial in Moscow, in the Hall of Columns, in front of the world's press. It was not a proceeding designed to determine anything. The verdict existed before the trial did. It was theater, staged with enormous care, and its audience was everyone outside the room. Powers pleaded guilty to espionage. He answered the questions put to him, expressed regret, and did not perform the defiance that some Americans watching at home expected of him. He was sentenced to 10 years, 3 in prison, 7 in a labor camp. And that was the second wound, because the pictures that came out of Moscow, an American pilot apologizing in a Soviet courtroom, were used at home to ask an ugly question about the man himself. Why was he alive? Why had he not used the needle or the destruct switch or died with his aircraft? A pilot who had survived being shot down at 70,000 feet came to be discussed in his own country as a man who had somehow failed. He served less than 2 years of it. On a February morning in 1962, on a bridge between Potsdam and West Berlin, the Glienicke Bridge, which the world would come to call the Bridge of Spies, Powers was walked to the middle and exchanged for a man named Rudolf Abel, a Soviet intelligence officer the FBI had arrested in New York. The negotiation had been carried out quietly through an American lawyer over months. 2 men walked past each other on a bridge in the cold, and each disappeared into his own country's version of the story. It was the first exchange of its kind, and it established the choreography that the Cold War would use for 30 more years. Powers came home. There was no parade. There were hearings and questions, and the persistent suspicion that he had talked. The Senate committee that examined his conduct concluded that he had done what he was supposed to do and had not betrayed his mission. The CIA quietly gave him its intelligence star, but the public verdict took much longer to change. Francis Gary Powers died in 1977, flying a helicopter for a Los Angeles television station, covering brush fires. He was 47. Long after his death, the awards began to arrive: a Prisoner of War Medal, a Distinguished Flying Cross, and finally, in 2012, the Silver Star, presented to his children for what the citation described as extreme loyalty while held by the enemy. 52 years late. The program he flew for was never really cancelled. Satellites took over the photography, but the U-2 itself is still in service today, 7 decades after Kelly Johnson sketched a glider with a jet engine in it, one of the longest-serving military aircraft ever built. And the lesson of 1960 was never really about the aeroplane. It was about what happens when a government is caught in a lie it did not need to tell. The Americans lied because they assumed the evidence had been destroyed. The evidence had not been destroyed. And everything that followed, the collapse in Paris, the wall in Berlin, the missiles in Cuba, flowed from the discovery that the most powerful country on earth would say something untrue and be believed right up until the moment it wasn't. So here is the question the file leaves open. Was the lie the mistake? Or was the mistake believing that anything at 70,000 feet stays secret? If you want the secrets of the last century brought into the light, subscribe to Cipher Glass. We are decrypting the 20th